on to happier things, or at least maybe more interesting ones. So, so we had this. We got a Discord discussions, and this is a topic that was brought up a couple months ago, actually, and has had a long conversation actually in our forums discussing what this actually means. It was originally brought up by Datum, and it was about structured encounters, and we kind of wanted to get a little bit more information about what that was referring to. I think that in the process, we came up with about 5 other topics that we'll have to deal with at some point. but we kind of got a better framework of what Datum was asking, recently writing about. I will read from his post. My original thought was actually around the use of structured encounters by a GM. So, in D&D and similar games, combat is very structured. I guess what I'm asking is, what needs to happen to trigger combat in D&D? This seems obvious, but do you really need the combat rules for a fist fight in a bar? Do hit points matter when someone isn't able to defend? These could be resolved with a different check, or maybe a single combat check. Okay, now I got a good feeling about what's going on here. Okay. Yeah. So I have seen encounters, and I've probably been in them, where it seems like something relatively simple will take you into, actually Dom had called it tactical mode. I think that's from an old, more of an old school idea, but generally roll for combat.
Right. Roll for initiative, you're in combat.
Roll for initiative, that activates combat. And I've seen times where literally the second somebody punches or like whips out a sword or something, combat, get that, go those initiative rolls. We're in it. Do you personally think that it needs to be utilized as much as that, or can we size this back a bit?
I think you can size it back. I think if you want it to be a combat, it can be a combat, but if it's more of a cinematic moment, for instance, if you pull a sword out and threaten somebody, it doesn't have to be combat. It can be like, all right, well, now you're like not getting aggro, but you're like, all right, you're almost into combat there. If you decide you want to start stabbing away and there's other people around or any monsters around, then it could turn into combat. But if you have your sword out, maybe it's just the one person. What if you just stab them through the heart and kill them instantly?
Yeah.
It's like, roll for murder.
Yeah. Can we have a roll for murder? I don't know if that's a constitution save or athletics.
Like, you're just straight up gonna stab them through the heart? Yeah, I'm just gonna stab them straight through the heart.
Yeah.
I wouldn't in that instance call for it to start combat. It wouldn't be like, all right, well, they're gonna draw their weapon. You'd be like, all right, I stabbed them in the heart.
Right.
It's in cases like that, or maybe if you're holding somebody up, if you as characters are mugging someone, is that combat?
Right.
Or is that, intimidation, and then maybe you knock them out?
Right. That seems more like a social encounter that has a super aggressive nature to it, but not
an aggressive social encounter.
An aggressive social encounter. Yes, exactly.
And that is the thing. Not all encounters are combat encounters, which I think is part of that structure thing.
Yeah.
Can things turn to combat if you either want them to or if they go south? Yes. They can, and especially D&D is a game where combat is heavily structured and regimented because kind of needs to be in a lot of cases as well. People enjoy that aspect of it, which is why a lot of people have said D&D is a glorified combat simulator sometimes, I think.
Right.
And it's not so many words.
Yeah, and if you did not have a combat component to like a D&D, a lot of the mechanics of D&D would be useless.
Yeah.
If you really think about it. I wouldn't have to worry about rolling to hit. I wouldn't have to worry about rolling for damage. I wouldn't have to worry about how fast I was. For most of it, I really wouldn't require those things if we didn't eventually have a tactical layout. If it was specifically story-driven and only story-driven, a lot of those mechanics could get thrown out. Who really needs spells or to worry about how much damage your spells do or for how long if you're not in a tactical framework where you need them? It's not nearly as heavy. But I would say that it makes sense to have an actual roll for initiative, get into combat, if this is legitimately a combat scenario. If you're not really looking to be in that, if it's not like an actual combat piece, I don't really see the purpose of it. I'm in a bar fight. I wouldn't even really consider a bar fight to be that. If I need to start considering, though, where I am on a map relative to everybody else, then I kind of need the tactical aspect. I need it so that I can figure out where I am and how fast I can act. But if it's just I have a disagreement at a bar, or I decided to join a boxing competition, I don't even know if you really need it for that. I get into a ring. Do you want to do a constitution save because they're trying to hit you and do a strength save or whatever?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say, roll with your base attack bonus plus your strength bonus and then roll your damage for something like that.
Sure.
I'd be like, all right, if you have a relevant skill, use it.
Right.
And otherwise you're using like either your stats or maybe you just narrate it. It's like, all right, the guy goes to throw a punch at you. What do you want to do? Have them kind of narrate slightly what they would like to do. I'm going to dodge to the side and give them a left hook or something like that. And be like, all right, roll to see how easy that is for you to do. Where maybe and I know other systems do this, where it's like the better you explain something, the better your possibility is to do this.
Right.
So it's like, all right, well, you explain that, and it's like, so we'll give you a little bit of a bonus to that roll, so roll and add +2 or something like that.
Certainly, yeah. I think from a GM's perspective too, I think it's going to amount to a lot of flow of the game, because we've talked about on the show is about the idea that if you have a combat relative to the time that you're in it takes a very long time to actually deal with.
Yeah.
And if you're doing storylines, it might take you like 10 minutes to explain what you do for a month. depending on how much. Yeah.
Time scale is usually 6 seconds per round. And I think the most anything D&D related or based, and that means you've got 10 rounds in a minute, and combat doesn't usually last 10 rounds.
No. But
combat does take
yeah,
like 20-30 minutes.
Oh,
get out of game.
Oh yeah, and if you think about like one round, so 6 seconds is a round, but you're probably spending a good 10 minutes to get everyone around a table doing their actions, or possibly more depending on how many enemies are involved. So it's like you're in bullet time when you get into tactical mode, and there's really no way around that. I always thought it was funny, though, if you're trying to have conversations in the middle of a combat, if your conversation takes more than 6 seconds, you technically couldn't do it in a round.
Yeah, I mean, most conversations don't take more than 6 seconds if they're just during combat.
Sure.
I would think. Unless you're trying to hold a monologue.
Yeah, that would be amazing, having someone try to do a monologue in the middle of combat, and you can only do 6 seconds of the monologue. And
that would actually be really great if you had your big bad evil guy in your combat with him, starts his monologue off on his turn, does like a sentence or two, stops, and then continues it on his next round.
Next round, yeah, that'd be great. Just a little bit of realism to let's function with the rules as written here. The other thing, though, I think of as from a GM's perspective, though, is you might end up in tactical combat when you don't necessarily need to be, if you don't have a lot left scheduled for that session, and you need to have a little time. You need to pad out the time a little bit.
I feel like that's what the random encounter tables in 3.5 and whatnot
probably
were for. It's like, do you need to pad out your time? Do you need to make more stuff for your players to do so you're not so you can wing it better,
Yeah.
have some random tables.
Right. Since we're on that subject, I start thinking about the opposite end of this, where we have to end an encounter. I mean, technically, if your enemies are defeated, then there's no one else to fight. That usually means that you end the encounter.
That means you've ended combat. You do your victory poses. You hear the victory do 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 do.
Hey, listen! And then,
That just blew out your mic.
hey, listen!
No, it just sounds really weird when you do that. You're gonna have to cut that out.
Listen! Anyway, so, well, we had to make a Zelda reference. Anyway, but realistically, when you get down to a certain, it becomes more obvious that you're going to win. Could we actually just end combat and start just doing a couple simple rolls to resolve the rest of it? You know,
Roll for victory.
well, if you had a case where, like, okay, the Goblin Horde is pretty much done, and there's a few left, and the idea that they're going to somehow get the upper hand on your party now is pretty minimal at best. Or I go to do a sleep spell, because of course I do. Put everybody to... Technically, they're still alive. They could wake up, but do we really need to keep padding out the combat so that your party can get to the tower, to get up the stairs to where the goblins are and secure them? And do we have to do that in rounds, or can we just say, hey, let's move out of combat? How do you want to resolve this, and see if a couple rolls will take care of it at that point?
Yeah, you could be like, all right, the armies are retreating. Would you like to end combat? Would you like to chase them down? Would you like to just murder them? What do you want to do? You could always give the players a few options for ways to do that. That isn't just structured combat. All right, you're moving 10 feet.
Mm.
All right, next round, 10 feet. Or whatever your speed is.
Mhm.
It's like that just gets nitty gritty, and well, I mean, if you're looking to pad out your time, it works,
Sure.
but I don't think that's necessary.
No.
It's like, all right, you see him retreating, what would you like to do?
Right.
You can be like, all right, well, we're gonna let him go, or we're gonna chase him down, and it's like, all right, well, they're retreating, so they're not fighting, so you can chase them down, and it's not really combat. I don't think you could be like, all right, you could do it as like roll for pursuit.
Okay.
Like, make an athletics check to see if you can catch up to them.
Okay. Yeah.
And then be like, all right, you catch up to them. Be like, do you want to murder them? Do you want to knock them out? What do you want to do? And then be like, all right, I want to do this. And then be like, all right, make a roll for that. And if they're retreating and they're goblins, let's say, you could easily just stab in the back and murder them if you're aiming to murder them.
Sure. Yeah. I think any time that you have a pretty weighted combat scenario, or what would be a weighted combat scenario, you can probably resolve it without actually having to do a tactical mode of any kind. Again, I want to punch somebody randomly at a bar. I don't think that's a really weighted combat issue, where we have to start really doing rolls to determine how bad this is. So, in terms of you as a GM, what would you say is a good percentage of time to be spending in tactical or in combat relative to the rest of the game?
Oh, I have no idea. That really depends on what your game is structured for, what you're planning to do, what your players would like to do, and honestly, what you have planned.
Right. I'll just throw out 25%. I think maybe a quarter of the time you could be in combat, because otherwise it gets bogged down really easy.
Sure.
And it depends. It does depend on how story driven it is. If you really want to have a story driven campaign, it might be less. But if you want to do dungeon crawls, you're probably going to be in tactical a whole lot.
Yes, because every 5 feet you're moving, you're scanning for traps, you are looking for everything. I did, I'm still doing the Essentials kit with my son and Ray,
Mhm.
and one of the things Ray said to me is going, if I had known I was going to be making this many perception checks, I would have taken it as a skill.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, well, yes, you do use it a lot because you're trying to see things. You're seeing how well you notice things. And
Right.
lots of things need to be noticed. So understandable. But there are other skills that are important too, but perception, especially when you're doing something that's got traps or doors or things to search for, is going to be something that is used a lot.
Yeah. And it also, there are going to be characters that benefit from not being in combat, and ones that are going to be very combat oriented.
Yes.
On that note of perception, like Snowball had a passive perception of 25. He's very good at that, or investigation I think was 27. He's going to be very good at things that are not combat related. Second combat comes in, not so much, but he was basically built as an investigator, not as a warrior or something like that. So it might depend on the fun that you're having as a character. Even though dungeon crawls, if you're coming into it and every 5 seconds I have to deal with a goblin, I'm thinking that maybe some of those could be resolved without having to actually get into combat. Like, I could do a sneak skill, sneak by them, and then roll for a backstab or something like that. Maybe I could do a social skill. I think it mostly has to do with what kind of game you're running, what the GM might want to do, and how much of a flow I think that's really what it comes down to, is about flow of game and how much we want to stop what we're doing for the narrative and the story and the progression to do a tactical, because it is going to take a lot of time. So, any other thoughts on that matter before we move on?
None at all.
Great.
This is our kind of take on the entire topic as well. There's obviously more that could be said on it. There's a lot of other things that could go with it, and if you would like to add more in the Discord, feel free to join in that discussion.
Oh, yes.
Which may or may not still be ongoing when this episode comes out.
Yes.
But we're always happy to hear other people's thoughts on things as well, or to discuss things further. Even if we do have a podcast format for it, so we don't necessarily have to type our thoughts out.
Sure. And I will read the last little thing that Adam had sent over too, because we are still having this conversation. It's been going on for a while now, but Adam says, I've been thinking about these questions as I learn new systems. I've always run high combat fantasy games like Star Wars and D&D, so learning Call of Cthulhu, I think this is the reason why he brings it up, has been really interesting. It places value on entirely different activities while still having structured rules for combat. Yeah, Call of Cthulhu is more interested in the investigative aspects and the sanity systems and stuff like that.
Right.
The narrative.
Think in a similar fashion, World of Darkness is more of an investigative game.
There's an argument to be made that, like, Vampire the Masquerade doesn't focus as nearly as much on combat.
No, but I think both those games, the combat can be incredibly lethal.
Oh, yes, because they need to get it over and done with quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very similar to the Warhammer Fantasy and the Warhammer 40k RPGs.
Mm-hmm.
Not familiar with the newest systems for them, but the ones that I have played in are, there's combat really bogs you down because there's just so many skill checks and things you can roll for, but the combat is incredibly lethal, so you could end a combat fairly quick because everybody is rolling the same amount of damage.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, the other thing that's going to determine how much combat you want to do is how deadly it is, because you might not actually want to get into combat. Also, side note, thought for another topic at another time, is about the lethality of combat determining how much we actually want to get into combat.
Yes.
Or if it promotes other systems like stealth or social encounters.
Well, on that note, one thing I generally do for my D&D games when I run them and have done for a while is I don't allow... I did it in one game, or I think I want to do it in one of the systems I have an idea for, is that healing magic
Mhm.
is more ritualistic, so it's not something you can easily use in combat.
Right. Gotta start making
So-
those health potions.
Yeah, health potions are fine. They take a turn action, but not giving players the ability to use spells in combat would definitely, or not use healing spells in combat, would be a detriment, of course, in certain systems, but it would be like, all right, well, you can't focus on mending a bone
Right.
or suturing that up correctly in combat. It takes a lot of concentration, so
Mm.
it's like, all right, well, if you want to heal, you need to be outside of combat, so
Sure.
you should retreat.
Right, exactly. So, thought for another time we can get into it. I'll try to make a note. But thank you for your question, and yeah, this conversation has gone on for a bit, and we will probably.
It's gone on long enough. Stop talking about it.
No, we can
Just
talk about it.
kidding.
We can talk about it more because out of all the conversations we've had on Discord, I think this one has unlocked more other topics to discuss than any other, so we appreciate it.
New topic unleashed.
A new topic has entered the arena. Perfect.